Well, good morning. My name is Arthur Brandwood, and welcome to this June 2019 edition of the Brandwood Biomedical live webinar series. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, TJ Thiel, and we're going to talk about post-market regulation. Good morning, TJ.
Good morning, Arthur. Excited to talk about this. There's a lot of activity in the space, and I think it's important that this webinar is quite apt for our medical device manufacturers and IVD manufacturers. So.
Good. So before we begin, we're going to have a couple of little things to say. First, a little bit of news. This will be the last Brandwood Biomedical webinar.
Yes.
It will. Doesn't mean we're going away, though, because we're delighted, and if you've been completely hiding under a rock and not looked at your internet for the last couple of weeks, you won't have noticed this, but we have announced it widely. But Brandwood Biomedical and our colleagues at Capital K Consulting, we've worked closely with Capital K for many years. They're the leading pharmaceutical consultancy here in Australia, and so the two have finally gotten together to form Brandwood CKC. So from next month, keep watching. Brandwood CKC webinars will continue. We'll look forward to carrying on, and in fact, we'll talk about that later. We'll actually have a pharmaceutical webinar for the first one in the new financial year.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Arthur, I think it's important that everybody knows that Brandwood is going to continue to operate in the same manner and support our medical device and IVD clients. But this is an opportunity for us to work in the pharma space, especially when we start talking about companion diagnostics and other devices that have a medicine applied to it. So this is a very exciting time for us, and we're very excited to be joining forces with Capital K, and I think bigger and better things are on their way.
Indeed they are. Indeed they are. So watch this space. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. This webinar is live. No, we're not recorded. We're actually here at this incredibly early hour in the morning in Sydney. Those of you joining us in the US at the more sensible hour, or across in Europe in the evening, welcome. If you have a question, you'll see on the control panel, there's a little pop-up control panel that should be at the top of the bottom of your screen. There's a little box called Q&A. Click on that. Type in your question, and we'll get to questions at the end. We will take questions, and we'll answer those at the end. So if you've got a question, there's how you do that. So I'm just going to begin this by showing this little slide, which says, I want to make a point that post-market events tend to make the news. They're the things that make exciting news copy. Nobody reports, oh, everything's normal, devices are getting approved. They talk about things when there are post-market accidents. And here's some examples, and they tend to result in regulatory change when they're big enough. And the first and probably most famous of all was a pharmaceutical well, thalidomide, way back in the 1950s, 60s. And that particular accident, the discovery of the teratogenic properties of thalidomide, led to all sorts of regulatory change. Here in Australia, it led to formation of what was then called the Australian Drug Advisory Committee, which went on to become ADRAC, which went on to become part of the later developed drug regulatory framework in Australia. Similar things happen in the US and Europe. So that led to much more stringent drug regulation. This is the Bjork-Shiley CC heart valve, which had a failure mode where the little wire struts there would break and release the disc, and with dire consequences for the patient. That led to the formation of the medical devices program in Australia. There wasn't a proper medical device regulatory program at that time, and the response to that accident, where there was a lot of those implanted in Australia, was to form a medical device premarket program. This is the Dow Corning silicone gel breast implant, and concern over silicone breast implants way back in the late 80s, early 90s led to a moratorium on those devices for a while, and then led to the introduction of a whole set of new requirements on medical device tracking, including in the United States and other places, the introduction of implant cards, which I find interesting. It didn't work back then. Implant cards were not particularly effective, but hey, we're going to have another go under the new European and Australian regulations. It's a bit different now. We've got barcoding and UDI and other ways of tracking. Another implant, breast implant, more recently the PIP one. This is still fresh in many people's minds. That feedback here. This is still fresh in many people's minds that with a commission of a regulatory fraud led to questions about the level of oversight of medical device manufacturers, and that's driven the recent change in Europe with the greater oversight of notified bodies. Yep. And the requirement for them all to be redesignated under a different framework. And then over the last couple of years, a number of high-profile events with implantable devices. This is the ASR metal-on-metal hip. We did metal-on-metal hips back in the 70s and 80s as well and had the same kinds of accidents. We've done it again. Yeah. That and surgical meshes and a couple of others have led to increases in requirements for clinical data and also for post-market follow-up of clinical evidence.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is that all of these are really newsworthy, and they really are the buzz feed and the Reddit streams of the day. And really they are the reason that pre-market regulatory has changed significantly in the amount of clinical data, in the amount of verification validation data that you need to bring it to the market. But at the same time, it's also affected the additional post-market requirements and adding more and more emphasis on tracking, complaint handling, so on and so forth.
And that now, we've been talking about this for many years. I, in a previous life as a regulator at TGA back in the 90s, I actually joined TGA as the director of Postmarket. And we talked about it a lot then, but still back in those days, there was much more emphasis on putting resources into pre-market evaluation. And that's changed now. I think the rhetoric is now becoming reality. And we're going to talk about some of the things today that the regulators are doing now, where they're turning the requirements of post-market into real stuff that is going to affect manufacturers.
Absolutely.
So let's take a look. Do you want to talk about what's going on in Europe?
Well, what's not going on in Europe? Between Brexit and the regulation changes here in Europe, I think there's a lot of things to be aware of and potentially concerned for. Obviously, the big things that we're focused on are the changes to the MDD and the IVD. Those obviously are moving to the MDR and the IVDR. The timeframes are May 23rd, 2020 and May 23rd, 2022, respectively. So it's significant. And I think there is additional considerations around the post-market space, and that's what we're going to focus on our talk today.
Okay, so these are the changes.
Yeah, so if we look at the actual changes in the MDR, I think the first two are pretty obvious, and that's that there's going to be more data required. Effectively, safety and performance requirements are going to be more significant, and we're changing the format as how those get applied to your technical file. There's updated classifications. So as we think about where devices are classified today, that's changing. And in some spaces, this is significant. When we talk about medical devices and software, all of that software is now changing. And that's going to be huge for a lot of companies that aren't necessarily putting together a technical file that will support a up-classified device. If we start thinking about the clinical evaluation, there's going to be additional and stricter review in that space. What you put into a CER is very different, and the amount of information that needs to be there will be more scrutinized. But the last one, and probably the one that is the focus of this talk, is the continuous vigilance and what you do for post-market surveillance and this whole idea of UDAMED. And we're going to get into that here in a second.
So these are the post-market elements, aren't they? Post-market in the clinical and post-market surveillance, and then use of this UDEMET database.
Correct.
Okay. And the Commission's made no secret of it. They publish a set of fact sheets. This is one that they published end of last year, about November, which was a fact sheet directed to the to regulatory authorities outside of Europe to talk about what was going on in the change in the regulations. And this whole section that says, look, we're going to require reinforced post-market surveillance. And it talks about trend reporting and periodic safety update reports. So here's some of the things that are going to be required. Now, post-market clinical follow-up, how's that going to work?
Well, I mean, ultimately, it's, as you can see in the slide, it's going to be mandatory for a lot of cases. So if we're talking about innovative products, the products that you're making significant changes on, anything that's related to high product risks related to the product, specific anatomical locations, cardiac.
That means all implants
as well. Pretty much.
Yeah. You know, so high anatomical location means anything that's inside the body.
Exactly.
is considered to be a high risk, which will require post-market clinical follow-up.
Yep.
And then when you get new information, so something changes,
yep,
follow that up. If you're going to do your CE marking based on equivalence, so you know, a lot of people want to do their clinical evidence not through direct clinical trials, but by looking at equivalence with other devices. Be aware the guidance says that if you do that, then expect to have to do post-market clinical follow up your devices for the clinical safety.
Yeah,
absolutely. And effectiveness.
And it's important to note that within the MDR, device manufacturers are supposed to design and run their PMCF studies, so the post-market clinical follow-up studies, with three major goals in mind. First one is confirming that the device safety and clinical performance is still there. Second is ensuring that there's continued acceptability of the risks identified with your product. And the third one is detecting emerging risks based on evidence. So it really comes back to having that full set of information that will continue to support the safety and effectiveness of your device.
Okay. So there's some new specific reports that are required, the periodic safety update report and the summary of safety and clinical performance. We're going to get used to yet more acronyms, aren't we? The PSUR and the SSCP. Let's look at the summary of safety and clinical performance first. So that's a report which is prepared by the manufacturer at the time they're wanting to place their device on the market.
Correct.
And it really gives an overview of the device and its safety and its performance. It's interesting because this is what also goes into the clinical evidence report. So we've got a lot of overlap between these reports. But this one, you identify your device, you talk about its intended purpose, you describe it, you place it in the context of what all of the therapeutic alternatives. So if there are medicines that treat the same condition, you have to discuss that and how this device compares to using medicines and how that sits in the context. You talk about what standards you comply with, you summarize the clinical evaluation, you provide details about users and who the users are and what training they need, whether it's professional use or use or whatever. And then you talk about risks.
Yeah.
And all of these things are in there, but note specifically, especially in the summary of the clinical evaluation, right there, relevant clinical post-market follow-up.
Yeah.
It's got to be there at the beginning. You've got to be thinking about what we know from existing post-market information on this or similar devices, and then keep updating that. And this report gets updated from time to time.
Absolutely. And what this reminds me of is the 510K summary report that you prepare at the end of your 510K process with the FDA, except it's like on steroids. So we're talking about basically summarizing your entire technical file and all of the relevant data related to the clinical summaries and user stuff, user information, risks, other alternative treatments. These are extremely,
and like the 510K summary, these are going to be public.
Absolutely.
So we'll talk about UDEMET in a minute, but these are going to be public reports. And then the periodic safety update. So this is something that gets done from time to time, where you actually summarize your post-market surveillance, and you say, provide a rationale if you've had to provide any corrective actions in response to things you've learned in the post-market surveillance, look at risk again, provide the main findings, and put it in the context of the number of devices supplied. So there's a denominator as well as a numerator. How many things went wrong, or what did you observe in the post-market, and what was that as a proportion of the number of devices sold? So we're looking at rates of occurrence.
Absolutely. So there's two things I'll mention here. One is this is the same kind of content. And again, Arthur, you mentioned it earlier, that there's a lot of overlap. This is the same kind of content that you would expect to put into your clinical evaluation report on your periodic review and your updates of that. So it's not completely unique. But at the same time, this is a significant undertaking, and we need to make sure that companies, manufacturers are doing these risk determinations and these trending, because before, the notified bodies, the competent authorities were doing that. They were doing that assessment. Now they're putting the onus on the manufacturer to do that for them so that they can understand and have a better scope across all of the medical devices as to how these devices are performing over the term of their use.
And they're required for everything except class 1.
Correct.
They need to be done per individual device or group of devices, but a group of devices the same. And it's something's lifetime. It never stops. You keep having to do these reports. And here's about that, how often. So how often have you got to do these? For class 3 devices and all implants, these are annual reports. And they have to be submitted to the notified body for review. They're not just something on file.
Correct.
These are reports that go to your notified body. So that means more money, more cost, because, of course, the notified bodies are going to charge you to do the reviews of these. So here's some additional regulatory fees associated with this as well. And in combination with an annual update of the clinical evaluation report, they're going to review those at the same time. For class 2Bs, again, an annual update. They don't have to be sent to the notified body, but they have to be updated. And then for 2As, at least every 2 years, or more frequently if the risks require it, or if there are things going on with the device and you maintain the technical file. So extra notified body reviews, and in some cases, for high-risk devices, these are going to be publicly available.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we have to talk about Unimed.
Yeah.
This graphic here, thanks and a shout out to Basil Acker at TUV. He presented this slide a couple of years ago in a program here in Australia and kindly allowed us to use it. These are some of the lines of communication that are built into the medical device regulations. And right in the middle there is Unimed, and everything points to Unimed.
Yep.
What is Unimed?
So Unimed is basically going to be that database of all of these post-market and information about your device as it relates to product performance, safety, complaints, so on and so forth. I think, ultimately the biggest thing is this becomes Europe's answer to MAUD, to DANE, except they're asking a lot more information.
And all the registration databases as well. So my understanding of Unimed is it's a huge database. It contains all the details of all of what they call economic operators, so all the manufacturers and the distributors and the importers and the authorized representatives. It contains all the details of all of the devices placed on the market. So every device has to be entered onto here and registered on here.
Yep.
It contains all of the reports associated with those devices. It contains all the notified body assessment reports and audit reports. It contains all the competent authority information.
Your summary information.
All the summaries, everything goes on, and all the post-market data.
Correct.
And the UDI information all has to end up in Unimed as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a massive database, multiple layers of access. Some of this database will be open to the public to go and read things like summary reports.
Yep.
Some of it will be just for competent authorities or just for notified bodies. Some of it with just your own manufacturer information on it. You can see it. Multiple layers of access, multiple languages.
Yes.
When's it going to be built?
So that's the $20 million question, so to speak. So Unimed is going to actually go live. I think it's the 26th of March, 2020. At that point, organizations will be required to enter their new or modified data for medical devices, and that must be done before the MDR comes to fruition, which is the 26th of May.
So it's a 3-month window.
Yeah, it's a very
2-month window.
short window for medical device manufacturers. For IVDs, you have a little bit more time. Obviously, the IVDR doesn't come to, doesn't become law until the 26th of May, 2022, and that's when you'll have that time to add your information to Unimed. As we talk about Unimed, one of the questions we often get is how is this going to work? And how are medical device manufacturers going to be able to work with the Unimed? And ultimately, medical device manufacturers are going to have to register with Unimed through their website, and then they're going to have to pass a conformity or a competent authority evaluation. So they're going to validate their information that's in Unimed based on the medical device manufacturers, and then you're able to provide your device-specific data.
Hang on. The manufacturers have 2 months to, when the database opens in March, assuming it's open in March, and there's a big question mark around that, because it's still being built. When the database opens in March, they've got 2 months to
register
for use, set up the user accounts, figure out how to use it, upload all of their data, and have those data reviewed and validated by the competent authority.
Yes.
All in 2 months.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not going to say anymore.
Yeah, I think it's pretty self-evident.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing to note is that Unimed themselves actually acknowledge the fact this is going to be complex and going to be a lot of work for medical device manufacturers. In fact, on their website, they actually have a big paragraph about how complex this is going to be and why they think medical device manufacturers aren't really taking it seriously at this time. It's not as simple, they've suggested that it's not as simple as just, another way of reporting post-market surveillance data, that it's actually much more complex, and that it may include a whole bunch of training, a whole bunch of internal processes being created, updates or revisions to your IT system.
So this is the systems in the manufacturer.
Correct. We're not even talking about Unimed. This is the stuff that the manufacturer, so every manufacturer will be responsible for. And so having that complexity, Unimed is direly concerned about manufacturers not taking that responsibility on board and understanding the scope of that. And that they're really, even when we just talk about submitting these reports, how are you going to put that together as a process? How are you going to train your staff to do that? Are you going to submit paper? Are you going to go through the electronic database or the electronic record capture system? These are all things that Unimed has brought up and wants manufacturers to address because they understand this.
And it's coming in
small.
less than 9 months' time.
Yeah.
So, all right. So now the database is being built. There are some recent modifications to the setup of the new regulations that essentially say that if Unimed's not ready on time, then there's a fallback to continue with the directives for a little while. The directives will still apply for the bits where Unimed is responsible. So that's going to muddy the waters as well, but we'll see. So let's just go on a bit and talk about the technical details. So I think the key point here is that clinical evidence is the central part. Post-market is fundamentally clinical. Post-market is what's going on in the clinic with the device or in the hands of the user. Clinical evidence is what really matters. Clinical evidence is itself is broadly defined and has lots of elements to it, but one of the key parts is that post-market clinical follow-up. So I'm going to just tell a little Australian story of how one of these things works here. Orthopedic devices. Now, in Australia, we have the Australian Orthopedic Association's National Joint Replacement Registry. It's a pretty well-established registry now. It's been going since the 1990s. it was something I was involved in sort of the genesis of, because the whole idea started when the Biomaterials Society got together with the Orthopedic Association, and we invited Peter Herberts, who was the founder of the Swedish Registry, to come out to Australia. And out of that seminar and that little conference back in 1994 was born the idea, and then the AOA set up the registry, and it's been going since the late 90s. What happens is it reports every year. There's an annual report. This is just a copy of the 2008 report. And within that report, they flag devices which are being revised at least twice the rate of their peers. So basically they track the revision rates of all implants. So revision meaning being replaced. The device has failed in some sort of way and is being replaced. And they look at the rate of revision of an individual device and compare that to the rate of revision for all devices of that type. So we might look at monoblock hips or unicompartmental knees or reverse shoulders or whatever. And they compare them and produce these sort of charts. The chart on the right here is a Kaplan-Meier chart. The blue line at the bottom is the rate of revision, cumulative percent revision for all devices of one type. And the green line at the top will be an individual model of device. I haven't talked about any particular one, but they do name the individual ones. And if the revision rate is more than twice, then they simply report that fact.
Yes.
They make no commentary on it. They just report the fact. Here we have a statistically significant revision rate for this model of device that seems to be more than twice that of its peers. And TGA takes a great deal of interest in this. In fact, they have a direct relationship with the registry where they get to see the data and they get a summary report at the time the annual report comes out. And they write a letter to each of those manufacturers who've been flagged in the registry. And they ask 9 questions. And I'm not going to read through these. These questions basically say this. These are the 9 questions. They say, confirm which registrations related to the device has been flagged in the registry. And then they say, tell us what you know. What's your in-house complaint data? Yep. And tabulate it, please, for Australia and worldwide. What's your associated sales data? Tabulate it, Australia and worldwide. What's your estimates of revision rate from your data? What other clinical and registry data do you have, including international registries? And then explain, what do you think is going on? Why have you got a higher revision rate? Have you done anything to the design to impact revision rates? And do the risk assessment. Outline the risks and benefits and why, and ask the specific question, are there benefits in your device that justify the apparent extra risk from revision? And what other information? So, that revision rate, this could be any post-market signal. It doesn't have to, this process doesn't have to apply just to an orthopedic revision rate. Any post-market signal where we're seeing something going on in the field, this could be subject to a regulator attention. And in fact, TGA does ask these sorts of questions on other things. Yes. It's a very standard approach. We see a problem, we see an apparent problem, please explain, justify why your device remains safe and compliant with the regulations. And TGA have become quite effective at they have a mechanism for this. They send out a formal request for information, and it can lead on to regulatory action.
Yeah, so just to bring that point home, I think, although these are the questions that the TGA asks, this is the same type of question that you'll get from any regulator. So these questions and this kind of information that are specific to TGA, but can be applied to any of the FDA, potentially where we're going with Utimed.
And with those post-market reports going into, they expect to see more.
Yeah,
the regulators are going to look at them. They're going to start asking this sort of thing. So, the reason I picked this as a particular story, the orthopedic industry, the manufacturers and suppliers of orthopedic devices in Australia have learned pretty much at their cost. They've learned the hard way that when you get these letters from the regulator, the stuff that's in the top 2 boxes on the top right, the manufacturer complaint data and the sales data, you better have good information.
Yes. Because
the regulator's now got a source of good information from a third-party registry. And if you haven't got good information to be able to explain what's going on, if you haven't been doing your post-market follow-up, then you are defenseless.
Yeah, and it's a very good point, Arthur. Ultimately, that's an easy way for them to identify that you're not doing the right thing when it comes to post-market follow-up. If you can't replicate or justify the numbers that are actually being reported in the registry, you're in trouble.
Yeah, and you either need to be able to show that they're right or have some good reason that the registry has got a picture that's not reflecting reality. And what I've seen in working in these cases many times now is that the local, it's quite interesting when you see the orthopedic guys say, here's our Australian data, and when they're asked for the global data, often the global data are nowhere near as good because the Australians have learned, they follow this up, they actively track the revisions, they follow up with their customers, and they've got, generally, most of them have got very good data which will match what's in the registry.
Yeah, absolutely.
The registry's it reports more than 95% of all cases, so it's got very good data. So, without doing that, you're defenseless, and that's really going to matter. TGA also do this, don't they? Tell us about conditions of approval.
Well, it's not unique to TGA, but I will bring it up as a specific example. So we're seeing more Brandwood and the work that we're doing in the medical device and IVD space. We're seeing a lot more conditions of approval being applied by the TGA. So they're basically going through a conformity assessment. They're coming to a summary or an idea that they believe that roughly safety and effectiveness are met, but they're now saying, you know what, we agree, we'll let you start marketing this under these following conditions.
Sure.
And it's really complex because sometimes these conditions are additional studies, they can be user requirements, specific use conditions, training requirements, and in addition, those post-market and compliance reporting piece. The interesting thing about the TGA is that they're not hiding this, that they're actually publishing specific conditions of approval. In fact, we've got an example here of a point of care conditions of approval for HIV testing. And ultimately, there are a lot of things that a manufacturer would have to do in this space.
And post-market requirements.
And post-market requirements are spelled out distinctly. And, surveillance report, having that done for the next 5 financial years. So 5 years of this extreme reporting for post-market.
And what happens if you don't send that report in on time?
Not good things.
And what happens is you get another letter from TGA saying, it's a condition of your registration that you submit this report. You haven't submitted it. Therefore, you're going to lose your registration unless you get it into us within usually a very short period of time, like the next 10 days.
Correct. and that it really can end up with you losing your ARTG entry
if you don't do the post-market follow-up, because this is a requirement on which the continuing registration depends.
And if we look at even in this specific section of the post-market surveillance report, you can see that they are absolutely interested in the number of tests sold in Australia and worldwide. Yep. Any of those adverse events that are reported in Australia and worldwide. So they want that data, and it's incumbent of the manufacturer to create and compile that data effectively. And that's where having that good system, having good systems in place needs to be a part of this. And they're making a specific case of this in the conditions of approval.
Okay. So let's now take a look at what's going on in the US. Again, if unless you've been hiding under a rock for the past couple of months, you can't possibly miss the fact that it's made news everywhere that there has been a summary reporting program. Those of us in the industry have known about it for a long time. And the idea of this summary reporting program was that when there were devices which had large numbers of reports, you could submit them as summaries and collect the data and submit them bulk rather than one report at a time. It was meant to be an efficiency measure.
Yep.
The only problem was it didn't end up on the public database in the way that all the individually reported was. And I don't think that was anything deliberately hiding anything, but the press have chosen to interpret it that way, that the industry and FDA have been hiding stuff by bulking everything up and not publishing it. And it's caused a huge fuss.
It certainly doesn't look good.
It's not a good look.
Yeah.
But so, FDA have ended summary adverse event reports, and now they've all gone out. And so that we realize there's a whole lot more reports on high profile, high risk devices than otherwise was publicly known about. And that's caused some responses and reactions. And, I don't think this story is finished yet.
No, not at all.
This is going to go on for a while. But FDA are doing other things. And here's their safety action plan. There was a statement that came out from Scott Gottlieb and Jeff Sharon back in November last year on the safety action plan to enhance specifically post-market safety. And here are some of the things they've done. So established this thing called NEST, the National Evaluation System for Health Technology. FDA talks a lot these days about real-world evidence gathering and looking at other sources of data. I think one of the lessons of the big post-market databases, the MORD database especially, which has hundreds of thousands of reports going into it every year, is there's an awful lot of noise and not much signal in those databases.
Yeah.
And they're really hard to use, statistically useless because it depends on the rates of reporting, which varies by device, by manufacturer, by device type. So they're good for looking at, MORD is good if you want to validate your assumptions in a risk assessment. If you assume there's certain failure modes, go and look at MORD and see if you're seeing those failure modes in other devices reported, but don't try and do statistics or whatever. And FDA have recognized that kind of post-market reporting is of unfortunately limited value. They've also recognized that clinical trials are designed to answer a very specific question in very controlled conditions, usually in the hands of very experienced clinicians. They don't reflect what's going to happen once they register that device and it gets into the hands of all the clinicians and it's in less control. So they're now talking about real-world evidence gathering, data from patient registries, Medicare claims, electronic medical records, things like insurance databases. We say, okay, we have a database here where we've got insurance claims for a particular procedure, say a laparoscopic cholecystectomy or something like that. Mm-hmm. Now let's look at the follow-on claims records for those patients that made a claim for that procedure and see what happens next. So you can see, and compare that to all others, see if there's a difference in clinical outcomes reflected in the database.
And see if there's safety issues that they needed to go and see another clinician to have revision or to have another surgery. All of that.
FDA is getting into collaboration on implant registries. They started with the National Breast Implant Registry. TGA does that as well. TGA's got a collaboration on a breast implant registry. And there have been some very specific actions in the area of women's health on vaginal meshes and a number of other women's health devices. So FDA is getting in on the act as well and is tightening up and going down some of the same roads.
Yeah, and I think the big thing that I'm taking away from the communications that are coming from FDA and other regulators in the space is that you brought the point up that clinical trials are extremely controlled and they aren't a very good estimation of all of the risks and the actual true safety of device. The only way for regulators to assess that is to look at what happens when it's in the field. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, you can't get away from having that stuff when you do your pre-market. They want to have some assurance that safety and effectiveness can be met. But this is the proof. Mm-hmm. This is the proof. When you actually go into the field and you looked at this longitudinally and you say,
we didn't expect that.
We didn't expect that. Yeah. So what are you doing about it?
Yeah. So that, and they're doing some test cases. You can see the sorts of things they're looking at the moment. This is up on the NEST website. You can see they're calling NEST CC, I think, for test cases. And looking at a whole bunch of things on pre-market submissions. Here's one where looking at real-world evidence, the very first example there for somebody doing a 510K, comparing alternative approaches for a wound closure device, post-market and labeling changes, all sorts of stuff. So a bunch of things being done at the moment. The Canadians, this is really hot news. This is just 4 days ago. Canada have put on their website an announcement that they're going to do a consultation on what looks very like post-market clinical follow-up reports from Europe. So basically, they've looked at MDR and said, okay, we're looking at doing the same thing. It's interesting. It's actually a revision to something the Canadians call Vanessa's law, which is actually a law that was put in place in Canada some time ago to require post-market reporting on medicines. And now they're bringing in medical devices into an amendment of Vanessa's law to require post-market follow-up. And it gives a number of additional explicit powers. So Health Canada will be able to require manufacturers to go away and do additional safety testing if they think there's a problem. They will require manufacturers provide analysis of safety and effectiveness to Health Canada. So there's your safety and effectiveness clinical report there, and annual post-market follow-up reporting. So doing all the same things that the Europeans have got into the Medical Device Directive. So that's a world tour of post-market as it stands. What are the takeaways from this? Let's just summarize some of this. So firstly, Europe's set a bit of a trend here, but they've not been the only ones doing this, but this is really going global, isn't it? I mean, the day post-market's really arrived, and it's arrived in terms of tangible actions and submission of real data to regulators. This is not something that you can be passive about, is it?
Yeah, no, I think that's completely on point. That, really what this comes back to is that although manufacturers have been doing this, there are now specific requirements and specific pieces that the regulators are looking for. And like you said, regulators are not unique. They always look at what everybody else is doing, and they want to make sure that they're being consistent. Now, we'd love to see harmonization in this space, but I think we're getting closer and closer to that. But Europe, with the MDR, has really set the bar. And now all of the other regulators, TGA, FDA, Health Canada, are looking at that and going, okay, we know that post-market surveillance is already an issue. We've got, again, going back to what hits the news, failures and failures in the field. So if we've identified that post-market surveillance needs to be done, and Europe is now saying this is the bar that we're going to set, well, why shouldn't we meet that same requirement?
And it's got to be active. That's the point. It's always been the issue that manufacturers say, well, customers don't complain. Well, have you gone and asked them? Have you been out and looked? And regulators now, it's no longer good enough to say we maintain a customer complaints, but we get very few complaints. You actually have to go out, actively follow up, actively see what's going on with your devices in the marketplace. Tell the regulators how you're doing that and satisfy them that you are being active enough.
Absolutely. I think there's more review in the pre-market side about your post-market plan than anything right now. I mean, I think when we start getting submissions ready and going to put those towards the regulator, one of the biggest questions we get asked is, okay, so how do you plan on following this up? What proactive and reactive strategies do you have for your post-market surveillance? Because they acknowledge that, a lot of times people just don't complain. But is that true? Are they really just not complaining to the manufacturer, but the other, all of that information is being captured somewhere else? And is your system able to capture that? That's what they're really focusing on in the pre-market space. But again, that's why this is cyclical. We talk about post-market issues driving new pre-market requirements, new regulations, new specific requirements for submission, but then also those are now driving more and more substantive post-market requirements.
Indeed they are. So systems are going to matter, aren't they? Systems are going to really be important here, and systems that talk to UDMED if you're in Europe, or to your local regulator wherever you are. So that's going to require more investment from manufacturers to manage all of this.
And again, we're not just talking about your IT infrastructure. I mean, although that is a part of it, we're talking about the actual systems and the processes you put in place and how you make sure that everyone that's associated with you as the manufacturer and your device, whether it's in the field, whether it's being distributed, whatever it happens to be, you have something in place to say, this is how we're capturing that information, and then we're reporting it in the manner that's been described.
Indeed. Lots more reports.
Oh, yeah.
Lots more reports. We've talked about what's going on in Europe, but we can see it's happening everywhere. And I say this again, without good in-house post-market data, when the regulator calls, you're the emperor with no clothes. You're defenseless. If you don't have active post-market follow-up, good data that justify your device safety, and clinical performance, when you get a query from the regulator, you've got to be able to go back and provide a robust answer and satisfy them that things are justified and that the risks-benefit relationships are appropriate. And if you can't do that, the regulator really has no choice.
Yeah. And I think not only do you have to do it on your side, and you have to make sure that you have that in-house post-market data, but you've got to do active surveillance of what else is out there, what other information is out there. So when it is in registries or when it's being reported to MOD, that you can actually rectify or reconcile those numbers. Because, that is a huge thing in justifying your position as to the safety and effectiveness of your device.
The way regulation works is that you as the manufacturer are responsible for convincing the regulator that you have evidence that your device is safe and effective. The regulator may get information from third parties, from other sources, but fundamentally they're always going to come back and say, you now tell us that you can still justify this device. And if you can't do that, you are without clothes. The regulator at that point has no choice, because they are fundamentally under the law required to rely on what you tell them.
Absolutely.
And so I can't emphasize this enough. This matters, and it will affect the longevity of your regulatory approvals if you can't do this properly. So I think we need to stop there. We've been going a little while. It's time for questions and answers. We've got a number of Q&As coming in. Let me have a look at the questions we've got.
So I've got a couple of questions from people that have submitted before the webinar, and so we can go through some of those. We've got a couple that have been put through. Just to make everybody aware, these slides and the webinar will be available on the website, so feel free to go to the Brandwood Biomedical website, pick these up.
Thank you, Brenda, for reminding us about that question.
I think the other question that's come through right now is that whether the PSURs are going to be public.
The periodic safety update reports.
Yes.
I'm not sure about that.
And I don't have an answer for that. That'll be something we have to take away, and we'll get back to you.
We'll check on that. But certainly the summary of safety and effectiveness will be, and I think for some of the high-risk devices, there's going to be public periodic safety update reports as well, but I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll check on that. But anyway, everybody will get an email to say with the slides.
Yes.
And the follow-up from this.
We've got a question here from Becky. She's asking when Unimed will be live, how do we register it, how is it similar to the US FDA's GUDID database? I think we've addressed most of that.
We have, I'd say that FDA database is only one. That's the UDI database.
Correct.
That's a tiny part.
Yeah, exactly.
So UDIMED will have a UDI bit amongst it, but there's a whole lot more goes on there. So there's the UDI stuff goes onto UDIMED, but the primary registration products goes onto UDIMED, post-market stuff goes onto UDIMED. All of your audit reports go onto UDIMED. They're not publicly visible, but they are visible to the competent authorities. So there's a whole lot more goes in.
Okay. Another question from Carol: What can be considered PMCF, so post-market clinical follow-up, other than clinical studies? And is the CER itself post-market clinical follow-up?
Okay, lots of things. You can have formal post-market clinical trials, and particularly implant manufacturers often do, but that's not something that's done for lower risk devices in most cases.
Right.
But it can be things like you're actively following up with your customers and asking them for feedback. You go out and have a standard script. Go and call a sample of your users and ask them for reporting. Train your field sales force to be talking to users and see what the feedback is. Looking at what's going on in the literature for devices of your type. So keeping on top of literature, keeping on top of what's happening in the field for all devices of the type that you're making. So it's a broad. It's like all clinical evidence. It's broader.
Absolutely.
It's not just about a clinical trial on your device. It's what's in. Keep an eye on the post-market databases. Look at the literature. Look at what you're seeing in conferences. Talk to your customers, and do this actively and do it according to a plan.
Yeah, absolutely. That actually brings us into another question from Snezana.
Snezna. Hello, Snezna. Yeah, we
Sorry.
know Snezna, yes.
As to how would a manufacturer go about contacting customers or having that part of the post-market clinical follow-up piece?
How to contact the customers? Well, you need to know who they are first.
Yeah. Well, that was going to be what I said. So I think this really comes back to, and you touched on it already, training your sales staff. Having them identify these customers or understand who's actually taking these devices on and who's going out there with these devices.
And if you've got lots of customers and a complex distribution system, a good CRM system, and building post-market into your CRM system.
Yeah.
It's something that might be CRM, customer relationship management software, for those that don't understand the acronym. So software packages that allow you to keep track of responses from customers and feedback and all of that.
We've got a question from Emmett. If you have well-established product with historical complaint codes, should you correlate those with harms in the FMEA?
Very good question. Very good question. With historical, yes, I think you should.
Yeah,
I mean, that undoubtedly. That's one of the things I was saying earlier is and it's not just FMEA. FMEA is part of risk management. Risk management is broader than that. But when you're doing hazards analysis, when you're doing your risk analyses like FMEA, you are, if you're at the beginning of a device development, often there's a fair bit of hypothetical in there. You're making estimates of likely failure rates. And a good way to validate those at least the failure modes is to go off and look at the public post-market databases and the literature.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
See what other people have seen in terms of how devices fail and validate that. And then if you've got historical data, you should be feeding that. Risk management is something that's a whole of life cycle that goes over.
Absolutely.
So if you've got established complaint codes and stuff, yes, absolutely, that should be going back into your risk assessment and being used to where you've now got real world data on actual complaint codes, actual things that go wrong, and frequencies.
Yeah. And
so
that's
you can
exactly
estimate the failure rates.
That's part of the requirements under ISO 14971 is to do periodic review of your risk, and having those historical codes and those complaints help you drive whether that your assessment of that risk is appropriate. So is that severity correct? Are the occurrences correct? Are you able to detect it in the same manner? Those kind of things are all easily available from that historical information. And you brought up the point, which isn't part of the question, but it is a way for you and your development of new devices to really get a good start as to what risk you might encounter.
Okay, we have a question from Jeff, who says, we mentioned registration in UDEMED. Will an SRN be needed for the registration? My conformity assessment body, CA, has not established a process for getting this done yet.
That I think we'll have to take that one away.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure I understand the full question there, but we'll come back to you on that one, Jeff.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, if we step back and we talk about registration with UDEMED, ultimately, again, the process is you're going to go onto the website. You're going to register as a manufacturer. Your competent authority will then go back and validate that manufacturing information to basically allow you to move forward with UDEMED reporting.
Yeah.
And I think, as we know, all of our competent authorities and notified bodies are still very much in flux.
Yeah.
And their ability to take on the MDR is becoming, a big process.
And some of them have their national registration databases, and all of that's got to be morphed into UDEMED as well. So I think this is what we're talking about here, is how all that works, and so much unknown yet.
Yes.
So it's keep a close eye on that UDEMED website and see what's happening there. Simrat says, with regards to the MIR form, we need to start using them from January 2020. Do we start using new timelines for the MIR forms, or old dates till we have to be compliant in May of 2020?
Ultimately, I think the answer is it's for you as the manufacturer to decide. Obviously, the date 26 May 2020 is a firm date. That's when the MDR is going to be applicable, and then you need to make sure that your reporting is according to that.
Yes.
Now, as a manufacturer, you can be proactive and start to do this because, again, I think as UNIMED has identified, there is concern that manufacturers are not taking this with the rigor that they need to. So it is, to me, it would be a good thing to start identifying and putting into process the eventual changes. Now, again, do you have to? No, but I think it's a good practice.
Yeah, if you can get on top of this earlier and be proactive, it's going to save you grief down the track.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I think we've answered all of the questions that have come through before and after or during this webinar. Just to reiterate and to follow up with Houston's question, as you have other questions or you have any other things that you would like some advice on, feel free to contact us at the website or the email address help@brandwoodbiomedical.com. But as Brandwood is in this space that we are very familiar with Europe, TGA, FDA, Health Canada requirements, as you have.
And we can help you directly, or we can help you with other resources located in Europe to get this done. So yes, do talk to us. So I hope that's been useful to our audience today. Next month, a Brandwood CKC webinar.
Absolutely.
And we'll have our principal consultant on reimbursement, Sarah Griffin, who will be hosting that webinar. And she'll be looking specifically at the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. That's the Australian PBS, which is the reimbursement process for medicines here in Australia. So an overview of the pharmaceutical reimbursement landscape and how to ensure you get paid for your medicine. And that's on the third Thursday third Thursday Australian time. It's the third Wednesday in the US. It's the usual time we do it, first thing in the morning here and late in the evening in Europe and
at mid-afternoon.
Middle of the day in the US. So look out for the announcement. If you've enjoyed this, you can follow us. You can see more information on our website. You can follow me on Twitter and on LinkedIn. We have a company page, Brandwood CKC, on LinkedIn. Our webinars are put out through our YouTube channel. We'll be sorting that out. YouTube make it a bit more difficult to convert things over, but that will become a Brandwood CKC channel. And the new website, brandwoodckc.com, is going live in a few days' time, so look out for that. Keep following us there. And we hope that we'll have many of you back for next month's webinar.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you and good morning.